our guy Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast, and also, I'd say, does a great job for the Canal Street Chronicles. Ross, how you doing, brother?
Hey, brother. Doing very well, man. Appreciate all that and glad to be back here with you, man. Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing pretty darn well, and I think I'm no longer going to give you any Saturdays off because I feel like every time I take a Saturday off or I give you one Saturday off, because a couple weeks ago LSU was playing a 9 a.m. game, 11 a.m. game, so I didn't have a show. They lost. I gave you off last week. They lose, but for what it's worth, I think to a certain extent, I was thinking about this before the show started, and I started to think I feel a lot like Kel at the end of Keenan and Kel during one particular episode because I feel like a giant jinx. Here's how I felt after the Saints-Giants game.
Drop the screw in the tuna.
That's how I felt after the game, Ross, because I said all week I was going with the Saints-Giants in my Survivor League, and you never go with your heart on those kind of picks. So I'll take it admittance and atone here and say that I dropped the screw in the tuna. I'm the reason why the Saints lost to the Giants.
No, I don't think it's entirely your fault. I think that there are a lot of things that factored into it. Maybe you played a small role in going with your heart in those situations. No, but I think that there was a lot going on in that game that led to a disappointing loss for the first home game in 636 days for that team. With full capacity and everything. First time that had happened over 630 days, and so. And it all kind of culminated in the fourth quarter and overtime, which is not when you want to have your sort of struggles in the NFL.
And, it was amazing just to see how things went in that contest because the Saints were kind of firmly in control of that contest. And to a certain extent, it's been mind-boggling to see how some of Sean Payton's play calling was because that was something that stuck to me as one of the biggest reasons why they lost that contest this past Sunday because you just didn't have that flash to it. Do you think to a certain extent that Sean Payton's playing scared to a certain extent on offense?
I don't think necessarily playing scared, but I do see that there's, a lack of familiarity amongst this offense. I mean, the only piece on this offense that Sean Payton is familiar with and that this team is familiar with is Alvin Kamara, and that's it. And that's why you've seen Alvin Kamara set career highs in carries over the last two games. He did it against the New England Patriots, did it again against the New York Giants when he got up to 26 carries, and he had his fourth 100-yard rushing game, his fourth 20-plus carry game as well. And so, I think that's more so what this is as these other pieces start to come back and, your two most important players on your offensive line and your blindside left tackle as well as your, protection calling center, those come back. Michael Thomas comes back, Traquan Smith comes back. Then all of a sudden there are more known commodities in terms of having multiple years in the system and, not being second to third year players as well, particularly as pass catchers. And so I think that has more to do with it than any type of fear or lack of trust, which has been a big conversation. I think we've kind of conflated trust and familiarity. I think familiarity is just as much a culprit here in terms of what the play calling has looked like here at the beginning of the season than anything else.
Talking now, Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast, and you bring up Alvin Kamara, and it was wild to see the fact this was his first game ever in the NFL without a reception. And we saw a lot more Taysom Hill taking away some of his cookies. I was definitely flabbergasted by that as well. It's it felt like to a certain extent, you bring up Alvin Kamara being the only guy really familiar with. I think Sean Payton started to let things be put in the hands of Taysom Hill to a certain extent in terms of getting that spark plug out there. And to a certain extent, it pays off like gangbusters. Case in point, he had a couple big touchdown runs in the red zone. But then you have a moment where he throws a deep ball when he's not necessarily known as a deep ball guy, and it goes right into the hands of a Giants defender.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think, Taysom Hill in the red zone is going to continue to be a theme just like it has been over the past couple of years. And, that's going to impact Alvin Kamara as a, touchdown scorer, fantasy point scorer, and all of that. Because we've seen Alvin Kamara have, double-digit touchdowns several times over the course of his career. And most of the time, that's also accompanied with double-digit red zone touchdowns as well. But now we're seeing Taysom Hill get, 2 in a game, and, he gets a lot of these touches in the red zone. So that's going to impact Alvin Kamara. But, the interesting thing is, you look at Alvin Kamara not having any receptions in this past game, and some of that has to do with the fact that the game plan had to shift in terms of how the backs were used out of the backfield when Tony Jones Jr. was injured. Those carries that would usually go to Tony Jones Jr. ended up going to Alvin Kamara, and so they ended up taking him out of the passing game a little bit to kind of keep some of those touches and therefore some of those hits off of him throughout the game. And then, also let's just give some credit to the New York Giants too. Don't let me not give them credit. They did a good job guarding him. And the first big run, quote unquote, by Alvin Kamara in that game was actually a pass. It's just that it was thrown backwards, so it counts as a run. So I think that, you saw them wanting to get him involved early, and I think you'll see that against the Washington football team this weekend. So they'll get him involved in the passing game early, sort of the way that they kind of corrected their, sort of atone for their sins when they only gave him 2 carries in the entire first half of the Carolina game. Then they turned around and gave him 3 carries right off the bat up against New England the very next week. I wouldn't be surprised to see Alvin Kamara catch a couple of early passes here against the Washington football team to get him going in that element of the game, because they need him in that role, because that helps to stretch the defense horizontally and opens up the middle of the field for a better passing attack and also a better running attack when you go back between the tackles.
Talk right now, Ross Jackson, Locked on Saints podcast and Canal Street Chronicles. But let's flip over to the defensive side of the football, because that was something else I noticed a lot. They just got tore up on these chunk plays and also third down conversions down the stretch. Danny Dimes, a guy who I've kind of wondered why the Giants picked him, looked godlike against this team.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the Saints did a good job for the first 3 quarters of this game. They only allowed 199 passing yards, 10 points to be scored. And then over the course of the fourth quarter and then the 1 overtime drive, that flipped to 203 passing yards allowed and 17 points. So, and all of those pretty much coming from passing plays, with the exception of the game winner in overtime when Saquon Barkley ran up the right side there. But yeah, I think that you saw the New York Giants do a really good job game planning and making some adjustments, not necessarily game planning, let's say making adjustments against the Saints man defense. They ran a lot of mesh concepts, a lot of crossing concepts that got their playmakers open. They finally started using Kadarius Toney. They hadn't used Kadarius Toney the entire season, and then all of a sudden it was against New Orleans that they figured out, this guy can do things when we put the ball in his hand, which they should have figured out a long time ago. But unfortunately, they waited until they were in New Orleans to figure it out. And, he had a couple of nice ones. And I think tackling was a big deal for the New Orleans Saints as well. You had one receiver for the Giants that caught a pass and just bounced off Malcolm Jenkins like a pinball and ran up the sideline on the opposite side. And, I think that tackling was a big deal for this team, and something that Paulson Adebo said that they worked on quite a bit over the course of the week here, getting ready for their upcoming game tomorrow. And I think that had a huge amount to do with it. The Saints, generally not a yards after catch team, right? They don't allow a lot of yards after catch, and they allowed almost 50% of the yardage that they gave up in the passing game to yards after catch in this one, and that's always going to cause you some trouble on the defensive side.
And, looking at that game coming up tomorrow, you've got a big game. It's Washington football team heading into that bye week. How important is it to get this win heading into that bye week and looking at 3-2, and especially because when you look 2 weeks ahead, you're not going to look ahead against Washington football team. There's no way, especially after what you did against the New York Giants. Mm-hmm. But knowing what you have against the Seattle Seahawks now, sans Russell Wilson, the schedule looks a lot easier. And I know one of our guys who hosts a morning show here on 103.7 The Game mentioned the fact that he'd be happy with 3-3. But if you're 3-2 and you're also looking down the barrel of, hey, you got Seattle without Russell Wilson, you're starting to look a little bit better and maybe smiling a little bit more at how much things are going for that program.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, you go into this bye week 3-2, it gives you a much better scenario in terms of setup, in terms of what you're looking at after that bye week, because you've got Seattle, then you've got Tampa, then you've got another division game against Atlanta, and then you're on the road to Philly, and then you're doing this, short week with the Thanksgiving game in a little bit after that as well against Buffalo, and then you've got another Thursday game against the Cowboys, who look really, really good, and their defense finally has some clarity with Dan Quinn doing a good job there. It's amazing what happens when Dan Quinn doesn't have to be a head coach and he can just focus on defense. And so I think that, getting as far ahead of your schedule as you can at this point is really beneficial. And, through the first, if you would have told me at the beginning of the season that, hey, through the first 6 games, this New Orleans Saints team with a first year in their system quarterback, without Michael Thomas, without 2 of their starting offensive linemen for a portion of the season, and without their number 2 wide receiver, and so on and so forth, all the injuries that they've had to deal with, that they would come out of that 4-2, then you'd feel really good about that. And I'd probably tell you that you're being a little bit too optimistic, but the Saints have that reality ahead of them right now, especially if they can get out into the bye week 3-2. Sean Payton's always been one of the best coaches when it comes to coming off the bye week. Regardless of whether Russell Wilson is under center or it's going to be Geno Smith under center, it's still going to be a very, very challenging game in Seattle, going up against the Seahawks, who have incredible receiver talent and have a good run game that they can get going as well. And so no matter what, that's going to be a challenging game. But if they can set themselves up for a chance at 4-2 heading to Seattle against a Russell Wilson-less Seattle Seahawks team, it's a really good position for them to be in as they continue to move forward. And so this game Sunday is about as much of a quote-unquote must-win as you can have in the moment this early in the season.
Who's going to have to step up the most tomorrow in your mind?
I think it's going to be the receiving core for the Saints. I mean, that to me becomes the thing. And I could look at the defense, but, the defense had a bad quarter and a drive. I'm not going to sit there and look at them like the guy from Waterboy and say, oh, no, now we suck again. It's not that type of a situation. Like, the Saints defense isn't all of a sudden bad. They had a bad quarter and a possession at the worst time possible, and that stinks. And that led to a loss. And I don't think that that's going to happen again. So I'm not going to look at the defense in particular, but for me, I am curious about this wide receiver core. If there is going to be a game where the wide receiver core gets production, it's going to be up against this Washington football team secondary that has struggled so far this season. They're near the top of the NFL in passing yards allowed. They're second in the NFL right now with 10 passing touchdowns allowed. Every member of that secondary has allowed a passer rating individually over 100 when targeted. I mean, they have struggled quite a bit. And so for me, it's that receiving core that needs to step up and I think has a good chance to do so.
I got one more for you, Ross. So we talked about Russell Wilson. He's out with a hand injury. Is Aaron Donald just basically trying to stack up fingers right now? Like, what the hell's going on?
I know. He's like going home and just like etching fingers into his wall every time he takes a finger out. It was remarkable. Like I had seen, oh no, Russell Wilson's hurt. Then when they ran back on the replay and then they were like, oh, it was Aaron Donald's helmet. I was like, oh, here we go again. Aaron Donald coming for fingers. He's snatching them up. I don't know. It was a wild situation. I did not expect that to be the case, but hey, you know what? Look, Aaron Donald impacts the game. And apparently a lot of fingers are impacted by Aaron Donald, so it's the trade-off you're going to get.
Hide your quarterbacks. Aaron Donald's out here just taking hands. All right.
That's right. Everybody glove up.
Exactly. Ross, thank you so much for coming on, my man. We'll talk to you in a couple weeks because I'm off again next week. Thankfully, it's a bye week, so I don't think we'll be affected.
All right, well, we'll keep a close eye on all the other Louisiana football teams when I'm not around for that Saturday, though. We'll just keep a close eye on everything else going on around the state. Yep. I appreciate you, buddy. Always a pleasure, man.